Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished and senior professional with a deep understanding of culture, consumer behavior, and brands from India and Dubai, Shagorika Heryani. Shagorika, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Shagorika is the founder of Athina. She has spent more than 2 decades decoding the hidden forces that shape culture, consumer behavior, and brands. She's also a speaker and a writer. So, Shagorika, my first question for you, tell me a little bit about your own journey in brief.
So, so I've been doing this for about 23 years. My work has always been at the intersection of strategy and culture. And
Mhm.
like you said, I've done it across India and the Middle East, but also Southeast Asia. So I worked with all the big agencies, so Gray and Chair, Seagram and Airtel, also brand consulting. So, that experience gave me both the inspiration, the motivation to start my own firm.
Mhm.
So today I run my own practice. It's called Athena.
Mhm.
And this is where I speak, consult, and write on brands and culture.
Yeah.
But at its core, the work that I do is it focuses on pattern recognition. So what I try to do is decode why consumers and cultures behave the way that they do, why they behave the way that they do, and the why now behind those behaviors. So, how that helps brands is that I think it helps them from not just chasing hype and trends, but actually understand what's driving culture, life, and consumers. But
Mhm.
the part that I really enjoy is conversations like we're going to have today. It
Great.
actually helps everybody make sense of their own behaviors and this crazy culture that we live in today.
Well said. And tell me, what are some of the hidden cultural signals that most brands completely miss today?
You know, I think the biggest cultural signal, which is pretty much, in my opinion, hiding in plain sight, is how culture gets shaped in the first place, right? Um, I think a lot of us who've been doing this for a while, we have this old mental model of how culture gets shaped, and it's fairly top down. So think a TV show, a big Bollywood movie, a national campaign, and that's what decides what's cool or aspirational or even normal.
Hmm.
But that model, in my opinion, is pretty broken, but we don't accept it fully just as yet,
Hmm.
especially as marketers. And what is replacing it, right? So I think there are two simultaneous forces coming together at the same time. One is the fragmentation of media itself, and the second is the decentralization of culture. So,
Hmm.
what I mean by fragmentation of media, if you look at the data, let's talk about India for a moment. So, 70% of India's vast internet users, they come from tier 2, tier 3 cities, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
regional language content typically gets twice as much engagement as English first content. And you can anecdotally see that happen around you, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So what that means is there's no single cultural conversation happening.
Yeah.
It's a decentralized cultural conversation happening in dozens of languages. You have Hindi and Tamil and Telugu and Bhojpuri and Marathi, which means we have that many more tastemakers, cultural norms, and references.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's happening is that we're actually, you know, guiding ourselves around these very hyper specific, passionate, small communities.
Hmm.
So you have a paddle community, you have a gaming community, you have indie music, you have all of these different niche wellness communities.
Hmm.
So what we call mainstream culture today, sort of shifts that we're seeing. So if as a brand or as a marketer, you're chasing the mainstream, I think you're actually chasing a ghost.
Hmm. Well
And
said.
I think brands are catching I, if I may, I like to give a quick example of a
Sure.
brand
Please.
that's
Please.
done it
Yes.
very well.
Yeah.
You, so look at Levers, right? Again, classic big mainstream media spender, big brand messaging spender.
Hmm.
it's now allocated 50% of its budget to the influencer marketing space. And it's interesting who they've chosen to work with. So they work with, over a period of 2 years, they've created a bank of 300,000 micro influencers and creators that they want to work with.
Mm.
And interestingly, their global CEO cited India and Brazil as two of the main reasons they've made that decision. I simply cannot do classic brand messaging there anymore.
Mm.
And finally, what that means is that it really challenges us as companies, as brands, as practitioners to really think about how that impacts things like
Correct. Mm. Mm.
strategy, actually be culturally fluent in this world. It's a very different mental model than the one that we have been used to for a long time now.
Mm. Well said. Great response. Tell me, why do some products suddenly feel inevitable at a certain moment in time? And what makes consumers emotionally attach themselves to some brands?
That's a great question. So when I think of what makes products inevitable, cultural timing. Sometimes it's luck, to be honest, the inevitability of products. So let's take. I also think it's companies that have understood the signal early and waited for the mainstream cultural timing to happen.
Mm.
So the sort of two examples that I love, which are quite obvious. Look at what happened with Zoom and Slack over the pandemic and
Mhm.
how its adoption came from a moment where all of us started remote working. If you look at the popular, they understood a very basic thing that stress is not something that happens to you once in your life. It happens every single day. So how do we sort of have your question, I think is actually really interesting, is emotional attachment. So emotional attachment is to me a little bit different. It's related, but it's not exactly the same thing.
Mhm.
So I think emotional attachment to a brand happens when the brand becomes a proxy for something the consumer is seeking in its own identity, signaling. The reason we buy brands is to help shape our identity. That's the sort of core of why we do it. So
Mm.
when the brand acts like a mirror for the identity that I'm exploring, seeking, that's when it starts to get interesting.
Mm.
And if I may, I'll give an example of a brand that I love and I speak a lot about. It's called Liquid Death. It's not available in India, but it's a big brand globally.
Mhm.
They sell water, just water in a can. It's not special. There's nothing special. It's just water. But people are obsessed with it. And it's one of the biggest marketing stories that has come out in modern history for a while.
Mm.
And the reason is, it's not that it created this new desire for hydration or wellness, but it understood a very simple thing about people, that people wanted to consume things which were good for them, but they hated the preachy aesthetic of, functional water, beautiful Himalayan water flowing out of somewhere, or the Swiss Alps. They wanted to be perceived as edgy and interesting. So what the brand did was it took all its design cues from energy drinks, which is very rebellious. All its marketing is literally sort of that. So it tapped into an edgy, rebellious self image that people wanted to say, this is who I am, this is who I really am. I might have a boring job, but on the inside, I'm a Harley
Mm.
Davidson rider,
Mm.
for
Mm.
example.
Mm.
And that means that when you think of the question that we ask, the question that we ask is, how do I make everyone love my brand, right? Every CEO, every CMO,
Correct.
everyone asks the same question.
Correct.
But I think the really important question to ask is, what identity work is our consumer trying to do right now?
Mm.
Our consumer, and how can we help them achieve that? When you
Mm.
start answering those questions, you get to inevitability, you get to attachment.
Very interesting. Well said. Tell me, how do culture and aspiration influence purchasing behavior in
Mhm.
emerging markets like India?
You know, you've been doing this for a long time, and I'm sure you have your stories to tell on
Mhm.
this. But India is And I'm repeating a cliche, it's the most fascinating market in
Correct.
the world, in my opinion.
Correct.
And on the one hand, everyone speaks about the demographic dividend and the demographic diversity, which is basically we have a young population and a diverse population.
Mm.
But let's talk about the third aspect, which I think is what makes culture and aspiration really interesting in India, which is that we have multiple versions of ourselves at multiple phases, all existing inside a single consumer,
Mm.
right? And that's what makes every consumer cohort that much more interesting. So
Mm.
you could have a young Indian who is extremely globally ambitious, globally aware, yet deeply anchored in local pride, traditional family values. You could have a consumer in India who is definitely status signaling, but also sort of very financially prudent because that's a system that we grew up in.
Mm.
And I love to call this the roots and wings paradox, right? And a great example of seeing what's happening with that and how culture and aspiration sort of come together in a market like India, where let's take the example of aspiration and financial prudence, both sort of trying to balance each other.
Mhm.
I love what's happening in automobiles and look at the explosion of SUVs.
Yeah.
So SUVs have now become, they're 55% of the passenger car market. And especially sort of like compact or urban SUVs, as they
Mm.
call them. If you sort of dig deeper, they
Mm.
sit at that intersection. They sit at psychology, they sit at aspiration, but they also sit on practicality. So yes, you get all the, it's great to navigate Indian infrastructure and potholes,
Yeah.
but it's also a social signal. It says, hey, I've arrived, I'm here, I can afford it, but guess what? I'm buying it at a price point which feels like my rational consumer self can
Mm.
justify it as well.
Mm.
Look at what's happening with beauty. We
Yeah.
didn't want Ayurvedic beauty in the way that our mums or grandmoms wanted it. We wanted the global Instagram aesthetic. And now brands are doing that. So, brands are becoming the bridge between these sort of seemingly paradoxical nature that rests within the same consumer. So I think India's always been multidimensional. And now we're seeing brands sort of really keep that at the heart of their brief rather than a problem that we want to flatten or solve for. And
Mm.
that's what I really love about what's happening in India today.
Fascinating. Great reaction. Thank you. Tell me, you were telling me a few minutes back about how Unilever has got 300,000 micro influencers. How are social media platforms amplifying cultural shifts faster than ever before?
So this is a personal view. I think they're amplifying it in a way that's really dangerous.
Hmm.
Okay. And I think there are many others who probably share that view. So let
Hmm.
me share first why I think it's dangerous and then get to how they're doing it, which makes them dangerous. I mean, look around, look at all of us. It's making all of us overstimulated, over anxious, and overwhelmed, right? And there are three things that are making us do that because why that's important to sort of like peg it to is because it makes us buy and behave in a way that is unhealthy, right? And it's going to catch up. But we can talk about that in a bit. But let me talk about the three shifts where to answer your question, how are social media amplifying cultural shifts?
Hmm.
The first is algorithmic amplification. The algorithm today decides what social shifts matter and why. So
Hmm.
if you look at YouTube or Instagram, they're not neutral in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Their their entire business model rests on the maximum number of people's being sticky on that app, right?
Hmm.
And to do that, they will push forward content that is designed to shock and awe. So content that, for example, triggers this reaction of joy or fear or doom scrolling or whatever it may be, that's what keeps you engaged, which means what could be a innocuous cultural moment suddenly becomes this big global phenomena that we all talk about. And, you know, it also means that you have brands and creators who are no longer talking about anything but that sort of temporary spike or hype. right? So real fundamentals of culture, brand building, any form of real connection is getting lost because you're trying to appease the algorithm.
Mm.
The other thing that's happening, I think, is again well documented but worth talking about is the global village effect, right? So there's no such thing as geographical barriers. So where we're getting our cultural influences from is completely dissolved. And I love seeing what's happening with young India and their love for all things Korean,
Mm.
right? So we have this amazing love for everything
Right.
K-pop, K-beauty, and Korean soaps. And it's interesting to see how that sort of affects brand behavior. So now you have Indian noodle brands coming in with Korean flavors, and you have a whole generation of young India who's mentally migrated to a place that they haven't been, but are following its aesthetic and its
Correct.
values.
Yeah.
And the third is, if you look at what's happening in terms of normalization. So India, India is a place where we need social proof in order for things to become acceptable or in the mainstream or in the norm. And
Mm.
that's what social media, I think, does beautifully, well or badly, depending on what you consider normal, is we create this feedback loop and you start to see it and it starts to get normalized, right? So it starts off as something which is, say, an outlier trend or content, and then it soon becomes just normal. The most simple example of that is that a few years ago, sharing your entire life, your vulnerability, your grief, your joys on
Mm.
social media was considered odd by Indians because we're not
Correct.
those people. Now we express on social rather than in real life. So I
Yeah.
think all of those three things come
Mm.
together and sort of really create a new culture.
Very interesting. Great response. Tell me what separates culturally intelligent companies from culturally tone deaf ones.
Oh God, this I could, I think, possibly talk about for a while, but let me try and be succinct for once.
Mm. Mm.
I think the difference is in organizational culture. And Ashutosh, you've been in the game for a long time, so you know
Mm.
how that works. I think organizational culture that understands risk and reward is what makes the difference between culturally intelligent companies and tone deaf companies.
Mm.
See, the thing about cultural intelligent companies is that they need to necessarily, for them to be culturally intelligent, they need to respond when it's a smoke signal,
Mm.
not when it's something that everyone is trending and doing.
Mm.
Which means you need to have a certain risk appetite, which means you need to break your own way of doing things.
Mm.
People will only do that if they feel the effects of that is not something that'll be a career killer. So
Mm.
if you have fear driving a company's organizational culture, it'll never be a culturally intelligent one. So in my opinion, tone deaf companies are the ones that don't understand cultural intelligence or
Mm.
consumer behavior or shifts. They are the ones where there is there's real punishment for actually taking big moves, right? So they just end up operating, the people inside that company end up operating in a way where it's easier to manage status quo, kick the can down the road, let me do my 2 year tenure as a
Move on.
C-suite
Mm.
person and then move on, right? So, and that's what happens over a period of time. You start dulling your own ability to hear a cultural signal and then respond to it.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, given everything that you already told me about Indian brands, and you were telling me about K-pop and Korean brands, are there any lessons that Indian brands can teach the world about cultural relevance?
Yeah, I think that I'm sort of just going to expand on some of the things that I was
Sure.
speaking about earlier and
Mm.
bring in a new thing, which has been my fascination of the moment, right? So, if you look at a classic Western model of brand building, it operates with a sort of homogeneous idea of culture. One mainstream conversation, one dominant aspiration. This is consumer ladder,
Mm.
but that's never been India, right?
Yeah.
Like we were discussing. we are an incredible nation of multiple simultaneous truths. So we have a lot of language, we have cultural calendars that vary state to state, and frankly, you have consumers where our lived realities, our fears, our aspirations, often in the same geographical area, besides the fact that they share geography, a lot of Indian consumers don't share their fears, aspirations, and lived realities. Okay. So so that's my first sort of truth that Indian brands have had cultural agility as a survival mechanism. We didn't invent it. It was the only way you could, sort of create something here.
Mm.
And that brings me to something that's happening in the world and everyone's speaking about, which is what's happening with AI, right? So everybody talks about how AI is essentially going to take over marketing. And it has in some ways. Some marketing functions are becoming more and more redundant. But I think that in India, it's going to be much tougher
Mm.
because these AI models are built on English dominated, flattened data. It simply can't hold Indian cultural nuance, right?
Correct.
So that's the thing, so when the world talks about human intervention, let's be human first. When it talks about taste, when it talks about context, when it talks about judgment, I think Indian brands have understood that at a cellular level way before all of these conversations happen. So I'm really interested to see how India is going to sort of marry AI. So you have sovereign AI models like Sarvam and Bhashini and all of these coming in.
Mm.
And it's really interesting because they're going to take our deep, deep cultural diversity and knowledge and sort of marry that with the way modern marketers function now. So I
Mm.
think the biggest example in 2026 that Indian brands can teach the rest of the world is that you can't have a flattened cultural assumption on your consumers and their behavior anymore.
Mm.
And goes back to the decentralization of culture point, right? So nuance is not a complication that we're all trying to iron out. It is literally the point of being a human being.
Mm. Well said. Shagorika, I have time for two more questions for you. My next question
So,
is, what, in your view, could be the ethical risks of using cultural intelligence in branding?
so you've asked me a question that I think is really close to my heart,
Hmm.
right? And so I think the world that we live in today, and we have touched upon some of this. We live in a world where we have a lot of collective anxiety, okay,
Correct.
for a bunch of reasons:
Mm.
geopolitical, economic, cultural, whatever, psychological. And I think what's happening is that marketing is being increasingly weaponized.
Mm.
Frankly, it always was, but even more than usual.
Mm.
And what intelligence does
Mm.
is that it makes that weaponization more precise, right?
Yeah.
So when people have real fear and frustration about their present and their future,
Mm.
we have a complete breakdown of identity. We have a loss of trust in our governments, in our media. There's all of those things happening.
Mm.
And what cultural intelligence does is that it gives brands a map of
Mm.
exactly where all of these fracture lines are. So the ethical risk
Yeah.
is that the map then gets used not to serve consumers, not to
Mm.
resolve their identity crisis or aspirations, but to actually exploit them.
Yeah.
Let's put more fear into the conversation.
Mm.
Uh, they play on our feelings of inadequacy, dopamine fix, the addiction loop that we all have, say with social media. Frankly, it's happening. It's happening at scale. It's very effective.
Mm.
It works, which is why I feel my fear is that more and more brands will default to it, right?
Mm.
And I try not to do it. I try not to work on projects or brands where I feel there's an ethical
Yeah.
risk.
Yeah.
Does that change the industry? Absolutely not. But I
Mm.
feel if a lot more of us were aware and acted on that, we would get to a better place.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. And my last question for you, Shagorika. Looking ahead, what hidden cultural forces do you believe will shape the next decade of consumer behavior and brands?
genuinely think the future is hard to predict, harder now than ever. But there are three things that I'm betting on, right? So the first is the absolute explosion of what everyone calls the longevity economy, right?
Yeah.
So we're living longer, we're living healthier, and more interestingly, we're free of the sort of social scripts of this is when you get your education, this is when you get married, this is when you do your job, this is when you retire.
Correct.
So we're freeing ourselves of all of that.
Yeah.
But if you look at the way brands are talking to people who are aging, right? Aging, I use for lack of a better word. They
Yeah.
still talk about senior living, active aging, very depressing language. It's completely far removed from what's happening with consumers.
Yeah.
So I think there's a massive opportunity, number one, right, on people who start betting on the longevity economy. And I'm betting on brands who are going to look at a 60-year-old and stop looking at that person as an old person and realize that for that guy or for that lady, she's 40 years old. She's young and she has disposable income and she wants to travel and she
Yeah.
doesn't want to be bound in the way that she was. So I think you're going to see a lot of re rejigging in what is the longevity economy, right? The second is I think that there is a deep crisis between reality and truth, and
Mm.
which is which, because frankly, the two don't seem the same. They should be
Correct.
the same, but they're not. But what I mean is, so AI is everywhere and AI is now ambient. It's no longer like will AI. It is AI exists. But I think you're going to see a
Yeah.
premium now on what is tangible, right? And what is tangible is human connection. What is tangible are the things that you do in the real world. What is tangible in, what feels genuinely human. So you're kind of seeing the early signs of that. Crochet as a hobby has taken off.
Yeah.
People, nostalgia marketing is big. People on the Kodak camera, the thing that we all thought was, sort of archaic is back. So I feel like a lot of what's going to happen in the next decade is that
Mm.
you're not going to have necessarily anti-AI sentiment alone. You're going to see a lot of companies, brands, and things happen in the pro-human experience.
Mm.
And the third, which I think is the most profound thing that is going to happen. And again, I'm hoping that we don't weaponize it, but we actually do something positive, is that for the first time in human history, we're literally seeing in front of us the dismantling of our own cultural script for
Yeah.
success, right? So for a long time, everything in our lives was a sequence, right? So you get the degree, you get the job, you stay on track, you get married, and then you buy the house, and then you buy the car, and then you have kids, and all of those wonderful things happen, right?
Mm. Mm.
But all of that is gone. You have AI, which is going to dismantle people's careers at whatever stage that career might
Yeah.
be. You're going to have education being important and unimportant all at the same time.
Mm.
You're going to have social contracts that are broken. People are, not following marriage and kids as a recipe for happiness, for example. So what replaces it? I don't know, right? I don't think any of us really know. But
Mm.
when millions of people, right, are simultaneously losing their sense of identity and what anchored them to a script of a successful life, I think it'll completely reshape consumption. It'll reshape value systems. It'll reshape identity. And brands can either be that bridge or they can sort of exploit it,
Mm.
whichever way it goes. But I think it's going to change how marketing functions in a way that we're just at the beginning of.
Very well said. And on that note, Shagorika, I can just want to say, what a fascinating conversation this has been on culture and its impact on brands and consumer behavior. Peter Drucker is supposedly has said culture eats strategy for breakfast. Nobody really knows whether he actually said it, but the conversation I've had with you today has given such amazing pointers on culture, its impact on brands, its impact on each one of us, and how technology and AI is getting enmeshed with so many different aspects of marketing, which you covered so well. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.